Pointing the finger, U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton blames al-Qaeda for new threats to attack Americans on home soil. The battle for one of Muammar Gaddafi's last remaining strongholds gets underway as NATO bombers target positions in the town of Bani Walid. An Arab discord, G7 finance ministers meet in France but fail to agree on measures to nurture the global economy. And autumn festivities, we visit South China to see how people are celebrating Moon festivities. Hello and welcome to CCTV News. I'm Chang Jun in Beijing. U.S. Vice President Joe Biden and former President Bill Clinton and George W. Bush are inaugurating a memorial near Shanksville in Pennsylvania. This is where the United Airlines Flight 97 crashed in the September 11th attacks. The ceremony will last 2 hours and will include musical tributes and the laying of wreaths. On Sunday will be President Barack Obama's turn to visit the memorial on the day marking the 10th anniversary of the attacks. Flight 93 was the only plane that didn't reach its intended target, thought to be the U.S. Capitol or the White House. 4 hijackers took over the cockpit 46 minutes into the flight between Newark and San Francisco. Several passengers and crew members made telephone calls aboard the flight and learned about the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. As a result, they attempted to overpower the hijackers. The plane crashed 3 kilometers north of Shanksville, killing all 44 people on board. A temporary memorial has stood for a decade at the site in southwestern Pennsylvania, visited by nearly 1.5 million people. The construction of a permanent memorial began in 2009. $52 million have already been raised, but organizers say they still need an extra $10 million. Now, for more information on the inauguration of the memorial, we now cross live to Priscilla Huff, who is at the scene. Priscilla, could you tell us how significant this memorial is to the American people?
This is a very significant memorial because this was the 4th plane from the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. And this plane was different from the other 3. Remember, 2 planes crashed in New York City and the 3rd crashed at the Pentagon in Washington. But this plane was different. The passengers knew, they learned that there were terrorists on their plane, and they took matters into their own hands, and they tried to take the plane back over again. It ended up crashing in a field in rural Pennsylvania. And for Americans, this place is significant and a field of honor because it reminds people that this is where Americans took things back. They took the process back. They stopped the terrorist attack and turned things around. And this is why this is a very emotional and significant place here in the United States.
Priscilla, could you give us some details about the construction of the memorial?
This memorial is not complete. They have raised a lot of money and they have it partially finished. What we're going to see unveiled here today is 40 marble plinths. Each has a name on it, and this honors each of the 40 passengers. The plinths overlook the actual field where the plane actually crashed. There's also far off in the field a boulder where that's also just for the families. So this space, there's also a field of honor so people can really look out on the beauty of the wildflowers and the open sky and how remote this place is. What they'd like to also build here is a museum, a visitor center, and a bell tower that will be 93 feet tall and be hung with 40 bells so that the voices of the 40 victims will ring out again. But at this point, there's just really an open space, and some architecture critics really feel that the memorial is perfect just the way it is. It doesn't need anything more. It needs to be a place of contemplation and remembrance and getting in touch with nature and the reality that is what happened here, and to be a quiet place of reflection.
Thank you very much, Priscilla. That was our correspondent, Priscilla Huff, in Shanksville. Now, U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton says al-Qaeda is behind a specific credible but unconfirmed report of a threat to harm Americans. Friday's report said New York and Washington were the main targets of terrorists. In a statement released by the Department of Homeland Security, 3 suspicious terrorists entered the U.S. and are plotting a car bomb attack. Earlier, President Barack Obama ordered a redoubling of counterterrorism efforts in the face of the threat ahead of Sunday's 10th anniversary of the September 11th attacks. Clinton also says it is impossible to foil every plot and that al-Qaeda is still capable of regional and international attacks.
This is a time when we are meeting here in New York amid a looking back as well as a looking forward, and with the news last night of a specific, credible but unconfirmed report that al-Qaeda, again, is seeking to harm Americans, and in particular to target New York and Washington. This should not surprise any of us.
Meanwhile, the U.S. is stepping up security after receiving evidence of a possible terror threat planned for the 10th anniversary of the September 11th, 2001 attacks. Former Vice President Dick Cheney is warning that such reports should remind Americans of the continuing threat posed by al-Qaeda. He's advising the Obama administration to return to a highly controversial program of enhanced interrogation of captured terrorism suspects he helped set up after 9/11. Meanwhile, New York's mayor during the attacks, Rudolph Giuliani, says America's leaders should resist public pressure to withdraw from Afghanistan and Iraq. The 2 former leaders are supporters of the neoconservative movement, which advocates strong use of American military power abroad to advance U.S. interests. Our Washington correspondent Daniel Renches reports.
In the days after the 9/11 attacks, the man who most openly shaped the intelligence response was Vice President Dick Cheney, who told America that he would turn to the dark side to protect the nation. So from his perspective, a new potential al-Qaeda bomb threat to New York and Washington on the 10th anniversary of those attacks provides yet another reminder of the need for strong tactics.
I do think it was a mistake for them not to stay as actively and aggressively involved.
Former New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani has also been reflecting on those days. He led the city's response to the attacks on the World Trade Center towers and is now also warning of the dangers of complacent thinking about security.
So we cannot use this as an opportunity to say, oh, let's put this behind us, because if we do that, we will repeat the mistake that we made before September 11th, which is not evaluating correctly the scope and the danger of Islamic extremist terrorism.
Shortly after he came into office, President Barack Obama banned the use of so-called enhanced interrogation techniques, saying the United States does not torture. Cheney says the simulated drowning method called waterboarding, which he maintains isn't torture, was only used on 3 suspects, including Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the self-confessed architect of the 9/11 attacks.
I think it's a mistake, for example, not to have an enhanced interrogation program available now. The president, when he canceled our enhanced interrogation program, said they were going to set up their own for high-value detainees, but as best I can tell, I don't think they ever have.
To counter that argument, many interrogation experts have said that these techniques lead to false information because a detainee will simply say anything he thinks the interrogator wants to hear. Former New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani says the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan were another way to prevent further terrorist attacks by eliminating safe havens for terrorists. The September the 11th attacks changed America in so many ways, not least in a massive ramping up of spending on military and intelligence with borrowed money. Now the challenge for the next decade of American leadership will be finding smarter ways to combat terrorism without spending more than the nation can afford. Daniel Renches, CCTV, Washington.
Egyptian troops clashed with dozens of protesters as they tried to push them away from the Israeli embassy, the scene of violent disturbances on Friday. An overnight rampage saw protesters tear down a concrete security wall outside the embassy before breaking into a consular office. Official documents were thrown off the balcony. Protesters then went to the roof of the embassy and pulled down the Israeli flag, replacing it with an Egyptian one. 3 people were killed, more than 1,000 people hurt, and 19 protesters arrested. Now, over in Libya, rebel forces are battling with Gaddafi loyalists for control of the desert town of Bani Walid, one of Gaddafi's last remaining strongholds, as a deadline for a peaceful surrender draws to an end. NATO warplanes have carried out at least 5 airstrikes on loyalist positions in coordination with the rebels' assaults. The attacks have met heavy resistance from loyalist forces. The rebels' chief negotiator, Abdullah Kanshir, describes the town as very, very well protected. The main fighting is taking place in the valley of Wadi Dinar, less than 2 kilometers from the main gates of Bani Walid. Loyalists fired Grad rockets and mortars, and snipers fired on the rebel fighters, trying to force their way into Bani Walid, killing at least 2. Staying in Libya, Muammar Gaddafi led a secret regime that is only now coming to light. One historical and political Libyan treasure was, until now, only accessible to a privileged few. Our correspondent Stephanie Freed has been granted entry to the grounds and has this report.
This is the People's Palace of Libya. Built last century, it was home to King Idris until he was deposed by Muammar Gaddafi in 1969. It was then transformed into a national library. Most recently, it served as Gaddafi's son Mu'tasim's semi-private showcase of Libyan history, mostly meant to impress outsiders. We aren't the type of outsiders who would have been allowed in before the current uprising, but due to circumstances, we were afforded a private tour. This museum was closed to the public. Libyans and tourists couldn't come here. It was a place for special visitors, for diplomats. In terms of world collections, this one isn't extraordinary. The opulence here is in the architecture. Stained glass overheads, marble columns, mosaic tilings, and traditional tapestries. Collection rooms provide a Gaddafi family tailor-made historical glimpse of Libya. There's ethnic handiwork from rural areas, and Roman-era marble and stone sculptures and busts. There's a future projects room with impressive designs boasting renewable energy and bioarchitecture. But sun-drenched Libya doesn't have solar energy or even an efficient waste removal system. This was clearly here to impress the guests. And there's the key controversial section. This is the Green Book room. Visitors would come here to get an audio-visual explanation of the Green Book, which was the pillar, authored by Muammar Gaddafi, of his social, economic, and political alternative ideas for society, alternatives to capitalism and communism. One small room houses Neolithic tools and artifacts from regions of Libya named by UNESCO as World Heritage Sites. Which is why Mu'tasim Gaddafi, who built his office and national security compound on the grounds, hid out here with his officers during recent NATO bombing campaigns. He knew NATO wouldn't hit the palace. Holed up inside, he monitored via security systems. But he and his men eventually fled, leaving behind their belongings. When this special brigade soldier entered the compound, he was issued a warning.
We found 3 bombs here inside the museum. It was in the case for the air condition. That information comes from one who works with the Mu'tasim here inside the museum.
Now the palace grounds are secure, and beyond this gate, the NTC military has housed its headquarters. Perhaps in the future, when the situation stabilizes, it will become the People's Palace once again. Until then, the gates remain closed to the public. Stephanie Freed, CCTV, Tripoli.
Still to come here on CCTV News, an era of discord. G7 finance ministers meet in France but fail to agree on measures to nurture the global economy. And autumn festivities, we visit South China to see how people are celebrating Moon Festival. An overcrowded ferry is sunk in the sea of Tanzania's mainland. About 600 people were on board and approximately 370 people are dead or missing. The ship was traveling from Zanzibar to Pemba when it capsized at Nungwing, an area with heavy currents in the deep sea between mainland Tanzania and Pemba Island. The accident is the worst of its kind in the history of Zanzibar. Rescue operations are currently underway, and according to local officials, so far about 230 people have been rescued and 40 bodies found. Overloading and technical errors are suspected to be the cause of the accident. Now let's turn to Hunan province in central South China. On September 9th, a ferry boat sank in Fui River near Shaoyang City. The accident killed 11 and injured 16, with another 3 passengers still missing. Wang Xinye tells us about how this tragedy occurred.
Though hope is slim, locals have not stopped trying. The ferry boat, designed to carry a maximum of 14, had 45 people on board.